If the truth had a price, how much would you pay to keep it buried? The courtroom felt colder than it should have, the kind of sterile chill that seeped through fabric and settled into bones, making every breath feel heavier than the last as Emily Carter stood there gripping the worn leather strap of her purse, her knuckles pale, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the judge could hear it echo across the room. And yet no one seemed to notice because all eyes were fixed on the small boy beside her. His fingers curled tightly around hers, his sneakers barely touching the polished wooden floor as he leaned into her leg, seeking comfort in a world he didn't understand, a world that suddenly felt like it was trying to pull him away from her piece by piece. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glow, flattening every shadow, exposing every flaw, and Emily could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Whispers floating like distant static as people in press suits shifted in their seats, glancing at her with curiosity. With doubt, with quiet assumptions they didn't bother to hide, and she swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand straighter even as her chest tightened, even as the words from the opposing attorney still rang in her ears, each syllable sharp, deliberate, designed to dismantle her life one sentence at a time. Ms. Carter has failed to provide a stable environment, he had said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed, as if her struggles were nothing more than bullet points on a page, as if the nights she stayed awake counting every dollar, every mile driven between jobs, every ounce of strength she had left didn't exist, as if love itself couldn't be measured unless it came with a bank statement attached. Beside her, Liam shifted slightly, his soft voice barely above a whisper as he tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, are we in trouble?" And the question hit her harder than anything else in that room because it wasn't fear she heard in his voice. It was confusion, the kind that made her throat tighten and her eyes burn, and she forced a smile she didn't feel, brushing a hand gently through his light brown hair. "No, baby, we're okay," she murmured, though the words felt fragile, like glass ready to crack under pressure. The judge adjusted his glasses, glancing down at the file in front of him, and for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting, suspended in that thin line between hope and something far more final. And then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a quiet but unmistakable click. A sound so small yet so sharp it cut through the tension like a blade, drawing every head toward it as a man stepped inside, his presence immediate, undeniable, the kind that didn't need introduction because it carried its own gravity, his tailored suit perfectly fitted, his expression controlled, unreadable, and yet there was something in his eyes, something deeper, something that didn't belong in a room like this. Emily's breath caught before she even realized why, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. Because even after all these years, even after everything she had forced herself to forget, she would have recognized him anywhere, Daniel Whitmore, the man whose name had once felt like a promise and later like a wound she had buried so deeply she thought it could never surface again. And yet here he was, walking down that narrow aisle with steady, deliberate steps, each one echoing louder than the last in her ears as if the past itself was closing in around her. The attorney paused mid-sentence, clearly thrown off by the interruption, but Daniel didn't acknowledge him, didn't acknowledge anyone, his focus fixed ahead, unwavering, until he reached the front of the room and stopped just a few feet away, close enough that Emily could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the subtle shift in his jaw as if he were holding something back. Something that refused to stay hidden any longer. Liam peeked out from behind her leg, his curious gaze lifting to meet Daniel's for just a second. And something in that fleeting glance seemed to freeze the air itself, a connection so quiet yet so undeniable it sent a ripple through Emily's chest, her pulse quickening as her mind raced, trying to piece together how this moment, this impossible collision of past and present, had come to exist. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Sir, this is a closed proceeding," he began, but Daniel finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying across the room with a calm authority that made even the smallest movement feel significant. "I'm aware," he said, his eyes never leaving Emily. "That's why I'm here." And just like that, the ground beneath her felt like it shifted, the fragile balance she had fought so hard to maintain beginning to crack as the truth she had spent years hiding threatened to rise to the surface, unstoppable, undeniable, and far more powerful than she had ever been prepared to face. The silence that followed his words did not feel empty, it felt heavy, like something invisible had settled over the room and pressed down on every person inside it, and Emily could feel it most of all as her fingers instinctively tightened around Liam's small hand, her mind racing through every possibility, every risk, every carefully constructed lie she had built over the past 5 years beginning to tremble at the edges. Because Daniel Whitmore was not a man who showed up without purpose, and he was certainly not a man who made mistakes, which meant he knew something or at least suspected enough to come here, to stand in front of a judge and disrupt a custody hearing that should have been simple, predictable, manageable, and now nothing about it felt safe anymore. The opposing attorney straightened his posture, clearly irritated but trying to maintain control. "Your Honor, I am not sure what this interruption is about, but my client would like to proceed," he said, his tone polite, but edged with impatience, while Emily forced herself to breathe slowly, to keep her expression steady even as her chest tightened, because panic would only make things worse and she had learned long ago that fear was a luxury she could not afford. Daniel, however, did not move, did not shift his gaze, his presence unwavering as if the entire courtroom had narrowed down to a single point between him and her, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was calm but carried a quiet weight that made people listen whether they wanted to or not. "I believe the court deserves all relevant information before making a decision that will affect a child's life," he said, and the word child seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, pulling attention back to Liam, who now peeked up again with wide eyes, sensing the tension even if he could not understand it. Emily swallowed hard, her pulse quickening as she stepped slightly in front of her son, a subtle movement that did not go unnoticed, especially not by Daniel, whose eyes flickered briefly to the gesture before returning to her face, reading her in a way that made her feel exposed, like he could see past the years, past the distance, straight into the truths she had hidden. The judge leaned forward, steepling his fingers as he studied Daniel with a measured expression. "And you are?" he asked, his tone cautious but open, aware that something significant was unfolding, and Daniel answered without hesitation. "Daniel Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Holdings." A name that immediately shifted the energy in the room, subtle but undeniable, whispers rippling through the gallery as recognition spread, because wealth carried its own influence even in places that pretended neutrality, and Emily felt it like a sudden drop in temperature, the realization that whatever happened next would not be contained within the small boundaries she had hoped for. The judge nodded slightly, acknowledging the introduction. "Mr. Whitmore, unless you have a direct legal interest in this case, I will need you to clarify your involvement." And for the first time, there was a pause, brief but noticeable, as Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, as if the words he was about to say required more than just composure, as if they carried consequences he fully understood. Emily's heart pounded harder, her thoughts spiraling as memories she had buried began to surface, late nights, unanswered calls, a moment that had changed everything, and the decision that followed, the one she had convinced herself was necessary, that leaving was the only way to protect what mattered most, because back then Daniel had been building an empire, and she had been nothing more than a complication he did not have time for. At least that was what she had believed, what she had told herself over and over until it became truth, until it became the foundation of every choice she made afterward. Liam shifted again, tugging gently at her sleeve. "Mom, who is that?" he whispered, his voice soft but clear enough that it cut through her thoughts, and Emily froze for just a fraction of a second, her throat tightening as she struggled to find an answer that would not unravel everything. But before she could speak, Daniel's voice came again, steady, controlled, yet carrying something deeper beneath the surface, something that made Emily's chest tighten in a way she could not ignore. "I am here because this case involves my son," he said, and the words landed with a force that did not need volume to be felt, the room falling into a stunned silence as the meaning settled in, as eyes turned back toward Emily, toward Liam, toward the fragile truth that had just been pulled into the open, and Emily felt the world tilt slightly, her carefully guarded reality beginning to crack under the weight of a single sentence she had spent years trying to prevent from ever being spoken aloud. The words did not echo, they sank, heavy and irreversible, settling into the silence like a stone dropped into still water, and for a moment no one moved, no one even seemed to breathe as the meaning spread across the room in slow, disbelieving waves. Because claims like that were not made lightly, and they were certainly not made by a man like Daniel Whitmore without certainty behind them, Emily felt it first in her chest. A sharp tightening that stole the air from her lungs as her vision blurred for a fraction of a second, her grip on Liam's hand tightening instinctively as if the world itself might try to pull him away from her right then and there. And beside her, Liam looked up again, confusion deepening in his eyes as he sensed the shift in tone, the way adults around him had suddenly gone quiet, the way something unspoken was pressing in from all sides. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice small, searching, and Emily forced herself to look down at him, to anchor herself in that one steady truth, brushing her fingers gently through his hair as she tried to steady her voice. "It is okay, sweetheart," she said softly, though the words felt fragile against the storm building inside her. Across from them, the opposing attorney recovered first, clearing his throat as he adjusted his jacket, his expression tightening as he glanced between Daniel and the judge. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he said, his voice carefully controlled but edged with urgency. "If Mr. Whitmore is making a claim of paternity, then there are legal procedures that must be followed. This cannot simply be introduced in the middle of a custody hearing without evidence." And his words seemed to restore some sense of order, giving structure to the chaos that had just been unleashed. But Daniel did not react with frustration or haste. Instead, he reached calmly into the leather portfolio he carried, the movement deliberate, measured, as if every second mattered, and when he pulled out a thin file, its edges crisp, its contents carefully organized, the simple action carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Emily's stomach dropped as soon as she saw it, a cold realization spreading through her as her mind raced ahead of what was about to happen, because she knew that look, she knew that level of preparation, and it meant one thing: he had not come here with a suspicion, he had come here with proof. The judge leaned forward again, his attention sharpening as he gestured slightly. "If you have documentation, Mr. Whitmore, you may approach," he said, and Daniel stepped forward without hesitation, placing the file on the bench with quiet precision, the soft sound of paper against wood somehow louder than it should have been in the silence. And as the judge opened it, scanning the contents, his expression shifted subtly, the neutrality giving way to something more focused, more serious. Emily felt her pulse in her throat now, each beat louder than the last as she stared at the file from where she stood, unable to look away, unable to pretend this was not happening, because every choice she had made, every reason she had clung to, every sacrifice she believed was necessary was now being laid bare in a room full of strangers, and for the first time in years, doubt crept in, quiet but insistent, asking questions she had refused to ask herself before. "This appears to be a DNA report," the judge said slowly, his voice cutting through the tension as he looked up at Daniel, then at Emily, and the words landed like a final confirmation of what could no longer be denied, and Emily closed her eyes briefly, just for a second, as if that small moment of darkness could shield her from the reality unfolding around her. Liam shifted again, his small fingers tightening around hers. "Are we leaving?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. And Emily's heart broke in that instant because she could not answer him, not honestly, not anymore, not when everything was changing faster than she could keep up. Daniel's gaze moved from the judge back to her, steady, unwavering, but there was something else there now, something that had not been there before, something that looked almost like pain, like realization, and when he spoke again, his voice was still calm but no longer distant. "I did not come here to take him away from his mother," he said. And the words caught Emily off guard, cutting through the fear just enough to make her look up, truly look at him for the first time since he had walked in. "I came here because I was never given the chance to be his father." And the quiet truth in that sentence hung between them, fragile and heavy all at once, forcing Emily to confront something she had buried deep within herself, the possibility that the stories she had told herself all these years might not have been the whole truth after all. The air did not move after his words, it simply lingered, thick with something unspoken that no one in the room seemed willing to break, and Emily felt it settle deep in her chest, heavier than before, because what Daniel had just said did not sound like accusation, it sounded like truth, and that made it far more dangerous than anger ever could be. Her fingers trembled slightly where they rested on Liam's shoulder, and she forced herself to stay still, to hold her ground even as her thoughts began to unravel, because for years she had built her life on one certainty, that leaving had been necessary, that silence had been protection, that distance had been the only way forward, and now that certainty was being questioned in front of strangers, in front of a judge, in front of the one person she had convinced herself would never understand. The judge glanced down at the file again, then back up at Emily. His expression measured but no longer neutral. "Ms. Carter, is there any reason why Mr. Whitmore would not have been informed of this child's existence?" he asked, and the question was simple, direct, yet it carried a weight that pressed against her like a wall, because answering it meant exposing everything she had tried to keep buried, not just for herself, but for Liam, and her throat tightened as she searched for words that would not fall apart the moment they left her lips. I made the decision that was best at the time," she said finally, her voice steady but softer than before, and even to her own ears it sounded incomplete, like a fragment of a story that had never been fully told. Across from her, Daniel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something in his eyes tightening as if her answer confirmed more than it explained, and for the first time since he had entered the room, there was a trace of emotion breaking through the calm surface he had maintained. Not anger, not exactly, but something closer to disbelief, to the quiet realization that the years he had lived without knowing had not been shaped by absence alone, but by a choice he had never been given the chance to make. The opposing attorney stepped forward again, sensing the shift, eager to regain control. "Your Honor, regardless of personal history, my client has provided evidence that Ms. Carter's current situation does not meet the standard required for long-term custody, and introducing this claim at this stage complicates the matter without resolving the immediate concern for the child's well-being," he said, his tone firm, strategic. But Emily barely heard him now, because her focus had narrowed to one point, to Daniel, to the weight of his presence and the questions in his eyes that she could no longer ignore. Liam shifted beside her again, his small hands slipping from hers as he looked up at Daniel with open curiosity, unguarded in a way only children could be. "Are you really my dad?" he asked, the words simple, innocent, yet they cut through the room with a clarity that no adult voice had managed to achieve, and Emily's breath caught instantly, her heart stuttering as the moment she had feared, the one she had tried to delay for as long as possible, arrived without warning. Daniel did not answer right away, and in that brief pause, something changed, something subtle but undeniable. As his posture softened just slightly, the rigid control easing as he looked down at Liam, really looked at him, taking in the small details that matched the image he had only seen on paper until now, the shape of his eyes, the quiet strength in the way he stood, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, but no longer distant. "Yes," he said, simply, honestly, and the words seemed to settle into the space between them like a truth that could not be taken back. Emily closed her eyes for a second, just long enough to steady herself, because everything was changing now, faster than she could manage, and when she opened them again, Daniel was still there, still watching her, but this time there was no distance left in his gaze, only a question, one that had waited years to be asked. And though he did not raise his voice, though he did not move any closer, the weight of it was unmistakable as it reached her, clear and direct. "Why did you decide I did not deserve to know?" And in that moment, Emily realized that whatever came next would not be about control or strategy or legal arguments. It would be about truth, the kind she could no longer hide, the kind that demanded to be faced no matter how much it hurt. Emily did not answer right away, because the question did not just demand words, it demanded everything she had spent years holding together, and for a moment she could only stand there, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, the quiet pressure of judgment and curiosity blending into something that made her chest tighten. As she searched for a place to begin, because there was no simple explanation, no single sentence that could carry the truth without breaking it apart, her fingers moved instinctively, brushing against Liam's shoulder again as if grounding herself in the only certainty she had ever known, and when she finally spoke, Her voice was steady but softer than before, shaped by something deeper than fear. "Because I thought you already chose your life," she said, her eyes lifting to meet Daniel's fully. Now, no longer avoiding, no longer hiding behind distance, and in that moment the years between them seemed to collapse into something raw and immediate. Daniel did not interrupt, did not challenge her, but there was a tension in his posture now, a stillness that felt deliberate, as if he was holding himself back from reacting too quickly, from letting emotion take control before he understood everything, and Emily saw it. Saw the effort it took, and it made the words that followed harder and easier at the same time. "You were building something bigger than anything I had ever been part of," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Every day was meetings, deals, travel, everything moving forward faster than I could keep up with, and I realized I was not part of that future." She paused briefly, not because she had run out of words, but because the memory itself carried weight, the quiet moments when she had stood in the background, watching a life unfold that did not seem to have space for her, for what she had to tell him. Liam shifted slightly beside her, looking between them, sensing the change in tone, the seriousness that had replaced the confusion, and though he did not fully understand, he stayed close, his presence a constant reminder of what was at stake. "When I found out I was pregnant, I tried to figure out how to tell you," Emily said, her voice quieter now, more personal. "But every time I imagined it, it felt like I was asking you to stop everything, to change everything, and I did not think that was fair to you." And there it was, the belief that had guided every decision she made, laid out in plain words, fragile under the weight of the moment. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, the controlled composure beginning to crack at the edges, not with anger, but with something far more complicated, something that came from hearing a version of himself he did not fully recognize, a version shaped by absence and assumption rather than truth. "So you decided for me," he said quietly, not raising his voice, but the weight behind the words unmistakable, and Emily felt them land, felt the truth of them settle into the space between them. Because he was not wrong, not entirely, and that realization made it harder to hold on to the certainty she had once relied on. "I decided for him," she replied, her voice firm again as she glanced down at Liam, her expression softening for just a second before returning to Daniel. "I needed to make sure he had stability, consistency, something that would not disappear if things got complicated." And the word complicated lingered, carrying meanings that did not need to be spelled out, because both of them understood what it could have meant back then, the risks, the pressures, the uncertainty of building something new while trying to hold on to something fragile. The judge watched closely now, his attention shifting between them, no longer just evaluating evidence, but listening, understanding that what was unfolding went beyond legal definitions, that it touched something deeper. Something human that could not be measured in documents alone. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly as he processed her words, but the question in his eyes did not disappear, it sharpened, focused, because there was still something missing, something that did not align with what he knew, with what he had seen in the file, in the timeline, in the quiet details that had led him here. "You say you tried to tell me," he said, his voice low but steady. "But there was no message, no call, nothing." And now there was a different edge in his tone, not accusation, but confusion, the kind that came from knowing part of the truth but not all of it, and Emily felt it immediately, the shift, the realization that this conversation was not just about her choices, but about something else, something she had not questioned before, and for the first time since he walked into that room, uncertainty crossed her face, subtle but real, as if a piece of the story she had believed so completely was beginning to move, to change, to reveal something she had never considered, and in that moment, the past no longer felt fixed, it felt unfinished. Emily felt the shift before she could fully understand it, the subtle fracture in the version of the past she had carried for so long, and it unsettled her more than anything Daniel had said so far, because doubt had never been part of the story she told herself, not until now. Her brow tightened slightly as she searched her memory, replaying moments she had once accepted without question, the unanswered calls, the silence that followed, the absence that had felt so absolute it left no room for interpretation, and yet now, standing here, hearing him say there had been nothing, no message, no call, the certainty began to unravel in quiet, uncomfortable ways. I called, she said slowly, her voice no longer as steady as before, not because she was unsure of the action itself, but because she was beginning to question the outcome she had always believed. I called you 3 times, the day I found out, and again the next morning. Her eyes searched his face as she spoke, looking for recognition, for any sign that he remembered, but Daniel's expression remained unchanged, focused, intent, and something in that stillness made her chest tighten. And I left a message with your assistant, she added, the details surfacing clearly now, as vivid as the memory itself, the polished office, the quiet voice on the other end of the line assuring her it would be delivered, that he would get the message, and she had believed it, she had trusted it enough to step back, to wait, to hope for a response that never came. Daniel's gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but inward, as if something she said had triggered a different line of thought, a connection forming beneath the surface, and for the first time there was a flicker of something sharper in his eyes, not confusion, not disbelief, but recognition of a possibility he had not considered until now. Who did you speak to? He asked, his tone still controlled but carrying a new intensity, one that made Emily hesitate for just a second as she searched for the name, something she had not thought about in years, something that had seemed insignificant at the time. I do not remember exactly, she admitted, her voice quieter now. A woman, I think she said she worked directly with you, that she would make sure you knew. And the moment the words left her lips, something changed in Daniel's posture, subtle but undeniable, his shoulders tightening, his jaw setting in a way that suggested the pieces were starting to fall into place. The courtroom faded slightly in Emily's awareness as she watched him, trying to understand what he was seeing that she could not, what detail had shifted the weight of the moment from uncertainty to something more defined, more troubling. Liam tugged gently at her sleeve again, his voice soft but curious. Mom! What is happening? And she glanced down at him, forcing a small reassuring smile even as her thoughts raced. We are just talking, sweetheart, she said, though the simplicity of the words did not match the complexity of the moment. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his expression deepening not with anger, but with realization, the kind that came too late to change the past but still demanded to be faced, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight, quieter, more deliberate, as if each word mattered more than the last. There was only one person who handled my personal messages back then, he said, his eyes locking onto Emily's, holding her attention in a way that made it impossible to look away. And she would not have ignored something like that. He paused briefly, not to create suspense, but because the conclusion he was reaching required certainty, and when it came, it did not sound like a guess, it sounded like truth. Unless she was told to. And the implication hung in the air, heavy, unsettling, shifting the entire direction of the story they had both believed for years. Emily felt it immediately, the ground beneath her assumptions giving way as a new possibility surfaced, one she had never allowed herself to consider, that the silence she had accepted, the absence she had built her life around, might not have been his choice at all, and that realization did not bring relief, it brought something far more complicated, because it meant the past was not just a series of unfortunate circumstances, it meant there had been intention, interference. Something deliberate that had kept them apart, and as she looked at Daniel now, really looked at him, she saw it clearly, the same understanding forming in his eyes, the same question rising between them, no longer about what happened, but about who had made sure it happened that way. The realization did not come with noise or sudden movement, it settled slowly, like a truth that had always been there waiting to be seen, and Emily felt it ripple through her thoughts with a quiet but undeniable force, because if what Daniel was suggesting was true, then the story she had built her life around was not just incomplete, it was wrong, and that kind of mistake did not just change the past. It changed everything that followed after it. Her breath caught slightly as she tried to process it, her eyes searching his face again, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that might suggest he was reaching too far, but there was none, only a steady certainty forming in his expression, the kind that came from connecting details that had been overlooked for too long. "You think someone kept it from you?" she said, her voice quieter now, not defensive, not firm, but searching, as if saying it out loud might make it easier to understand, and Daniel gave a slight nod, not rushed, not exaggerated, just enough to confirm what they were both beginning to see. "I know how my office worked," he replied, his tone measured, controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something sharper, something personal. "Nothing reached me without being filtered, scheduled, approved, and if something did not make it through, it was not an accident." And the implication settled heavily between them, because accidents were easier to accept, easier to forgive, but intention required accountability, and that changed everything. The judge shifted slightly in his seat, clearly aware that the conversation had moved beyond the usual boundaries of a custody hearing, but he did not interrupt, perhaps because he understood that whatever was being uncovered here would directly affect the decision that needed to be made, not just legally, but ethically. Liam looked between them again. His small face filled with quiet confusion as he tried to follow the exchange, his world simple compared to the complexity unfolding around him, and he stepped a little closer to Emily, his hand finding hers again, grounding her in the present even as her thoughts drifted into the past. "There was a woman," Emily said slowly, the memory sharpening now that she allowed herself to revisit it. "She sounded confident, like she had handled things like this before. She told me not to worry, that you would be informed right away." And as she spoke, the image became clearer, the polished tone, the assurance, the subtle authority in the way she spoke, and suddenly it did not feel like a neutral interaction anymore, it felt calculated, controlled. Daniel's gaze hardened slightly, not toward Emily, but toward the realization itself, the quiet recognition of a pattern he had not questioned at the time, because he had trusted the system around him, the people he had placed in positions of control. And now that trust felt misplaced in a way he could not ignore. "What did she say exactly?" he asked, his voice still calm but more focused now, and Emily closed her eyes briefly, replaying the moment as clearly as she could. "She said you were in the middle of something important, that your schedule was full, but she would make sure you received the message personally." She opened her eyes again, meeting his gaze. "And then she asked if there was anything urgent that needed immediate attention." And the words lingered, because now, with everything shifting, they carried a different meaning, a different intention. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his expression deepening not from confusion anymore, but from clarity, the kind that did not bring relief, but rather a sharper understanding of what had been taken from him without his knowledge. "That sounds like her," he said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for Emily to hear, and there was a weight in those words that made her chest tighten again, because it confirmed what she had started to suspect, that this was not coincidence, that this was not miscommunication, that this was something deliberate. The opposing attorney glanced at the judge, clearly uncertain whether to intervene, but the moment had already moved beyond formal structure, beyond the neat boundaries of legal argument, and into something far more personal, far more consequential. Emily looked down at Liam again, her fingers gently brushing his shoulder, and for the first time since Daniel had walked into the room, her fears shifted, not disappearing, but changing shape, because if the past had been manipulated, if decisions had been made without her knowledge, then the foundation she had relied on was no longer stable, and that meant the future was uncertain in a way she had not prepared for. She looked back up at Daniel, her voice softer now, but steadier than before. "Who would do that?" she asked, not as a challenge, not as an accusation, but as a genuine question, one that demanded an answer either of them had fully faced until now, and Daniel held her gaze for a moment, the silence stretching just long enough to make the answer feel heavier than the question, before he spoke, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a truth that shifted everything once again. "Someone who believed they were protecting me," he said, and in that moment, the distance between past and present collapsed completely, leaving them both standing in a reality either of them had chosen, but both now had to confront. The answer did not feel complete, it felt like the beginning of something far more complicated, and Emily could sense it in the way Daniel's voice settled after he spoke, in the quiet tension that remained in his posture, because the idea of someone interfering, someone deciding what he should or should not know, did not sound like a distant possibility anymore. It sounded personal, specific, and dangerously close to the truth. Emily's chest tightened as she tried to piece it together, her mind moving through fragments of memory she had never questioned before, the polished voice on the phone, the calm assurance, the subtle authority that had made her believe everything was being handled properly, and now those same details felt different, sharper, like pieces of a puzzle she had never thought to complete. "Protecting you from what?" she asked quietly, her voice steady but edged with something deeper now. Something that came from realizing that the decision she thought she had made alone might not have been hers to make after all, and Daniel held her gaze, his expression controlled but no longer distant, the answer forming in a way that seemed inevitable, as if he had known it long before he was ready to say it out loud. "From anything that could complicate my life," he said, his tone even, but the weight behind the words unmistakable, and Emily felt them land with a quiet force, because it was not difficult to imagine how someone in his world might see her, a young woman with unexpected news, a situation that did not fit neatly into the structure of ambition and control that surrounded him, something to be managed, redirected, removed. Liam shifted again, his small hand tightening around hers as he looked up at her, sensing the seriousness even if he could not understand it. And Emily instinctively pulled him closer, her protective instinct grounding her even as her thoughts continued to unravel. "So someone decided for both of us," she said, more to herself than to him, the realization settling in with a quiet finality, and Daniel did not correct her, did not soften the implication, because there was nothing to soften. The truth did not need adjustment, it simply needed to be faced. The judge leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled again as he observed the exchange, his role shifting from arbiter of facts to witness of something far more personal. And though he remained silent, his attention did not waver, because what was unfolding here would inevitably shape the outcome of the case before him. Daniel's gaze flickered briefly toward Liam, just for a moment, but in that glance there was something that had not been there before, something that went beyond recognition or curiosity, something that looked like connection forming in real time, fragile but undeniable. And when he looked back at Emily, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. "I would not have walked away," he said, not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a statement of truth, and Emily felt the words settle into the space between them, challenging everything she had believed for years. She searched his face again, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that this was something he was saying because of the situation, because of the pressure of the moment, but there was none. Only a steady sincerity that made it harder to hold on to the version of him she had carried in her mind. "You do not know that," she replied softly, not with anger, but with uncertainty, because part of her still needed to hold on to the belief that she had done what was necessary, that her choices had meaning, that they had not been built on a misunderstanding. Daniel did not argue, did not push, but his eyes did not waver either. "You did not give me the chance to know," he said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any argument could have, because it was not about what might have happened, it was about what had never been allowed to happen at all. Emily looked down at Liam again, her fingers brushing lightly against his hair, and for the first time since the conversation began, her certainty felt fragile, not gone, but shifting, because if the past had been shaped by someone else's decision, then the life she had built, the sacrifices she had made, were not just hers alone, they were part of something larger, something she had never seen clearly until now. The opposing attorney shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the judge and the two of them, clearly aware that the case he had prepared for was no longer the same case unfolding in front of him. But he remained silent, perhaps understanding that any interruption now would only fracture something that needed to be fully revealed. Emily lifted her gaze again, her voice steady but quieter. "If that is true," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "then someone made sure we never had this conversation before today." And Daniel gave a slight nod, his expression tightening just enough to confirm what they both now understood, that this moment, This confrontation, this truth, had been delayed not by chance, but by design, and as the realization settled fully between them, it did not just change how they saw the past, it changed what they would have to do next, because some truths, once uncovered, did not allow you to simply walk away. The truth no longer felt like something distant or abstract, it stood between them now, solid and unavoidable, and Emily could feel its weight pressing against every thought she tried to hold on to, because if someone had truly intervened, if someone had decided what Daniel should or should not know, then the life she had built had not just been shaped by her own choices, it had been shaped by someone else's control. And that realization carried a quiet kind of anger she had never allowed herself to feel before. She drew in a slow breath, steadying herself as she looked at him again, her voice no longer uncertain but grounded in something new, something that came from understanding that the past was no longer fixed in the way she had believed. "Then we need to know who made that decision," she said, her tone calm but firm, and Daniel did not hesitate, because for him, the answer was already forming with a clarity that came from familiarity, from knowing the structure of his world, the people within it, and the motivations that often hid behind polite words and professional roles. "There is only one person who would have had both the authority and the reason," he replied, his voice measured, but there was a sharper edge beneath it now, something that had not been there before, something that suggested this was no longer just about discovery, but about accountability. And Emily felt it immediately, the shift from confusion to direction, from questioning to knowing. That the truth, once uncovered, would not remain unanswered. The judge leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening again as he recognized the significance of what was being implied, because this was no longer just a matter of personal history, it was a matter that could directly impact the fairness of everything that had followed, including the case before him. "If there has been interference," he said carefully, his voice steady but authoritative, "then it is relevant to the court's understanding of this situation." And the acknowledgement carried weight, validating what had been uncovered while also grounding it within the legal framework that still surrounded them. Liam looked up again, his small face thoughtful now rather than confused, as if he could sense that something important was happening even if he could not fully understand it, and he glanced between Emily and Daniel with a quiet curiosity that made Emily's chest tighten again, because this was not just about them anymore, it was about him, about the story he would grow up with, about the truth he would eventually come to understand. Daniel's gaze softened briefly as it met Liam's, just for a second, but in that moment there was something unmistakable there, something that went beyond recognition or obligation, something that looked like a connection trying to form despite the years that had passed, and when he looked back at Emily, his voice carried that same quiet determination. "Her name is Margaret Whitmore," he said, and the name seemed to settle into the room with a quiet finality, because it was not just any name, it was one that carried weight, influence, and a history that neither of them could ignore. Emily felt the impact of it instantly, her breath catching as the pieces aligned in a way she had never considered before, because of course it would be someone close to him, someone with access, someone who believed they had the right to decide what was best, and the realization did not just answer a question, it raised a deeper one. "Why?" "Your mother," she said quietly, not as a question, but as a confirmation, and Daniel gave a slight nod, his expression tightening just enough to reveal that this was not a conclusion he had reached lightly, but one that made sense in a way nothing else did. "She managed everything personal during that time," he explained, his tone controlled but carrying an undercurrent of something more personal now, something that came from recognizing the extent of her influence. "She believed she knew what was best for me, for the company, for everything." And the implication was clear, that anything she saw as a threat to that vision would not have been allowed to interfere. Emily's mind moved quickly now, connecting the confidence in the voice she had heard years ago, the assurance that everything would be handled, the quiet dismissal of urgency, and it all fit in a way that made her chest tighten, because what she had accepted as circumstance now looked like intention. The opposing attorney shifted again, clearly aware that the situation had moved far beyond the arguments he had prepared, but he remained silent, perhaps understanding that interrupting now would only complicate matters further. Emily looked down at Liam once more, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, and for the first time, the fear she felt was no longer about losing control, it was about understanding how much had been taken from all of them without their knowledge. And when she looked back up at Daniel, her voice was steady, grounded in a new kind of clarity. "Then she needs to answer for it," she said, and Daniel held her gaze for a moment, the determination in his expression matching her own, because whatever came next would not just be about the past, it would be about making sure the truth was finally seen, finally heard, and no longer controlled by someone else's decision. The name did not just settle into the room, it lingered, carrying a weight that extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom, and Emily could feel it in the way the air shifted, in the way even the smallest movements seemed more deliberate now, because this was no longer just about a misunderstanding or a misconnection, it was about influence, about power, about someone who had quietly shaped the course of their lives without ever standing in front of them to answer for it. Emily's hand rested firmly on Liam's shoulder, her posture straighter now, steadier, because the uncertainty that had once defined her decisions was being replaced by something else, something clearer, something grounded in truth rather than assumption. And when she looked at Daniel again, there was no hesitation in her expression, only resolve. Daniel, however, remained still for a moment longer, as if measuring the distance between what had been revealed and what still needed to be confronted, his gaze shifting briefly toward the judge before returning to Emily, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but carried a quiet authority that made it impossible to ignore. "Your Honor, I request a temporary suspension of this proceeding," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "There are facts that directly impact the integrity of this case that have not yet been examined." And the request did not sound like a suggestion, it sounded like a necessity. The opposing attorney immediately straightened, clearly prepared to object. But before he could speak, the judge raised a hand slightly, signaling for silence as he considered the request, his expression thoughtful, weighing not just the legal implications but the human ones as well, because what had been uncovered could not simply be dismissed or overlooked. Liam shifted again, his small fingers tightening around Emily's as he looked up at her, his voice quiet but sincere. "Are we going somewhere else?" he asked, and Emily knelt slightly beside him, bringing herself to his level, her expression softening just enough to reassure him even as everything around them remained uncertain. "Not yet, sweetheart," she said gently, brushing a strand of hair away from his forehead. "We just need to listen for a little longer." And though the words were simple, they carried a calm that grounded both of them in the moment. Daniel watched the exchange, and for a brief second, something in his expression softened, not enough to break the composure he had maintained, but enough to reveal that this was no longer just about uncovering the past, it was about understanding the present, about seeing the life that had existed without him and deciding what role he would play moving forward. The judge finally spoke, his voice measured but decisive. "Given the new information presented, this court will grant a temporary recess," he said, his gaze moving between Emily and Daniel. "However, I expect all parties to return with any relevant documentation or testimony that can clarify the circumstances in question." And with that, the structure of the moment shifted once again, from confrontation to preparation, from revelation to what would come next. The subtle sound of movement filled the room as people began to stand, to gather their belongings, to exchange quiet words that carried curiosity and speculation, but for Emily, everything felt strangely focused, as if the noise around her had faded into the background, leaving only the space between her, Daniel, and Liam. Daniel stepped closer, not too close, not in a way that imposed, but enough to close some of the distance that had defined their interaction until now, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, meant only for her. "I am going to speak with her," he said, and he did not need to say the name, because they both knew who he meant. "And I will find out exactly what happened." And there was no doubt in his tone, no uncertainty, only a quiet determination that made it clear this was not something he would leave unresolved. Emily studied him for a moment, really studied him, not as the man she had remembered, not as the figure she had built in her mind over the years, but as he stood now, present, engaged, and undeniably real, and for the first time since this began. She allowed herself to consider Something she had never fully allowed before, that maybe the story had never been as simple as she believed. Liam looked up at Daniel again, his expression thoughtful, curious, and when their eyes met, Daniel offered a small nod, subtle but intentional, and though it was not a grand gesture, it was enough to acknowledge him, to bridge a gap that had existed for far too long. Emily stood slowly, her hand still resting protectively on Liam's shoulder, and her voice, when she spoke, was steady, grounded in a clarity she had not felt before. "I will be here," she said, not as a question, not as a request, but as a statement, and Daniel met her gaze, giving a slight nod in return, because for the first time, they were no longer standing on opposite sides of a story. They were standing at the same point, facing the truth together, and whatever came next would not just define what had been lost, it would define what could still be found. The hallway outside the courtroom felt different from the silence inside, not quieter, but less controlled, filled with the low murmur of voices, the shuffle of footsteps, the distant hum of conversations that carried fragments of speculation and curiosity. Yet for Emily, it all blurred into something indistinct as she guided Liam to a nearby bench, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as she sat down beside him, trying to steady the rhythm of her thoughts that had been pulled in too many directions at once. Liam swung his legs slightly, his sneakers brushing against the polished floor, his eyes lifting to meet hers with a question that had been building quietly since everything began. "Mom, are we in trouble?" And the simplicity of it made her chest tighten again, because in his world, things were either safe or not, and she had always tried to make sure he stayed on the side of safe, no matter what it cost her. She forced a small, reassuring smile, brushing her fingers through his hair the way she always did when he needed comfort. "No, we are not in trouble," she said softly, her voice steady even as her thoughts continued to shift. "We are just figuring something out." And he nodded slowly, accepting her answer with the kind of trust that both comforted and humbled her, because it reminded her that everything she had done, every decision she had made, had always come back to this, to protecting him, to giving him a life that felt secure even when hers did not. A few feet away, Daniel stood near the window at the end of the hallway, his posture straight, his expression composed, but there was a tension in the way he held himself now, something that suggested the conversation ahead would not be easy, and Emily could see it even from a distance, the quiet weight of what he was about to confront settling into his shoulders as he took out his phone, his movements precise, deliberate, as if he was preparing not just to make a call, but to face something he had avoided for far too long. She watched him for a moment, her thoughts shifting again, because this version of him, the one standing there now, did not match the image she had carried for years, the distant figure who would not have made space for her, for them, and that realization did not erase the past, but it did change how she saw it, how she understood the choices she had made. Liam followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Daniel, curiosity replacing confusion now. "Is he coming with us?" he asked, his voice quiet but thoughtful, and Emily hesitated, just for a second, because the answer was no longer as simple as it once would have been. "I do not know yet," she admitted gently, her honesty soft but real, and Liam seemed to accept that too, leaning slightly against her side as if grounding himself in the moment. Across the hallway, Daniel lifted the phone to his ear, his expression unreadable from where she sat, but something in the stillness of his stance made it clear that this was not a casual conversation, that whatever he was about to say carried weight, history, and a truth that had been delayed for too long, and when he finally spoke, though she could not hear the words, she could see the shift in his posture, the slight tightening of his jaw, the controlled breath that followed as if he was choosing each word with care. Emily looked away after a moment, her focus returning to Liam, because no matter what happened next, no matter what truths were uncovered or confronted, her role had never changed. She was his constant, his foundation, and that was something she would not allow to be shaken. Time seemed to stretch in that hallway, each minute passing with a quiet intensity as the weight of what was coming settled in, and when Daniel finally lowered his phone, there was a difference in his expression, subtle but unmistakable. The kind that came from hearing something that confirmed what you already suspected, something that did not bring relief, but clarity. He turned then, walking back toward them with steady steps, his gaze meeting Emily's before he even reached her, and in that moment she knew that whatever he had learned, whatever had been said on that call, it had changed something, not just for him, but for all of them, and when he stopped in front of her, his voice was low, controlled, but carrying a truth that could no longer be avoided. "She knew," he said simply, and the words settled between them with a quiet finality, because they were not a question, not a possibility, but a confirmation, one that shifted the weight of the past into something undeniable, something that demanded to be faced not just as a mistake, but as a choice that had shaped everything that followed. The words did not come with explanation, they did not need to, because the certainty in Daniel's voice carried everything Emily needed to understand, and for a moment she simply sat there, her hand still resting on Liam's shoulder, her thoughts moving slowly as the full weight of what he had just said settled into place, because knowing someone had suspected was one thing, but knowing they had known, truly known, and still chosen silence, that was something else entirely. Emily's breath left her quietly, not in shock, but in a kind of steady release, as if a question she had carried for years without realizing it had finally been answered, and though the answer did not bring comfort, it brought clarity, and that clarity changed how everything behind them now looked. "She admitted it?" Emily asked softly, her voice calm but deliberate, and Daniel gave a slight nod, his gaze steady, his posture controlled, but there was something different in him now, something heavier, something that came from hearing a truth he had not been prepared to face. "She said she believed it was necessary," he replied, his tone even, but the words carried an edge, not of anger, but of disbelief, as if he was still processing how someone could make that decision so easily, so completely, without ever questioning its cost. Liam shifted beside Emily, his small hand tightening slightly as he looked between them again, his eyes searching their faces for something he could understand, and Emily instinctively drew him closer, her arm wrapping gently around his shoulders as she grounded herself in his presence. Because no matter what had been revealed, no matter how the past shifted, he remained the center of everything. "Necessary for what?" Emily asked, though part of her already understood the answer, already felt it in the pattern of everything that had been uncovered, and Daniel exhaled slowly before responding, as if the explanation itself carried weight. "For stability," he said, his voice quieter now, more measured. "For control, for protecting the company, for protecting my future." He paused briefly, his eyes lowering for just a second before returning to hers. "She said she did not think I would make the right choice if I knew," and the words settled between them with a quiet finality, because they revealed not just the action, but the belief behind it, the assumption that someone else had the right to decide what his life should look like, what risks were acceptable, what truths could be ignored. Emily felt a shift inside her then, something subtle but significant, because for years she had believed she was the one who made the decision, the one who chose silence, the one who shaped their lives, and now she understood that while her choices were real, they had been influenced, guided, even manipulated by someone who had never faced the consequences of them. She looked down at Liam, her fingers gently brushing his shoulder again, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel it fully, not just the frustration, not just the realization, but the quiet strength that came from knowing that despite everything, despite the interference, despite the years of misunderstanding, she had still built something real, something strong, something that could not be undone by the truth of how it began. Daniel watched her carefully, as if trying to understand what she was thinking, what she was feeling, and when she looked back up at him, there was no anger in her expression, only a steady clarity that had not been there before. "She took that choice from both of us," she said, her voice calm but firm, and Daniel did not argue, did not soften it, because there was nothing to argue against. The truth stood on its own. The hallway around them continued to move, people passing by, voices rising and falling in the background, but for them, the moment felt still, contained within its own quiet space, because everything that mattered had already been said, everything that needed to be understood was now clear. Liam looked up again, his expression thoughtful, his voice small but certain. "Does that mean he stays?" he asked, his gaze shifting toward Daniel, and the question, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything else in that moment, because it was not about the past, it was about what came next. Emily felt it immediately, the shift from what had been uncovered to what would be decided, and she glanced at Daniel, not with hesitation, but with an openness that had not been there before, because for the first time, the future did not feel like something she had to protect on her own, it felt like something that could be shared, shaped together. Daniel met her gaze, and though his expression remained composed, there was something unmistakable in his eyes now, something steady, something certain, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "If that is what he wants," he said, and the answer, simple and direct, did not carry pressure, did not demand anything, but it held a promise, not of perfection, not of certainty, but of presence, of choice, of a future that would not be decided without them. Emily looked back at Liam, her hand resting gently against his shoulder, and for the first time since everything began, she allowed herself to breathe fully, because whatever came next, whatever decisions were made, they would be made in the light, not in silence, not in absence, and that alone changed everything. The courtroom felt different when they returned, not because the walls had changed or the judge sat any differently behind the bench, but because something inside the room had shifted, something that could not be undone now that the truth had been spoken, and Emily could feel it in the way her steps were steadier, in the way her hand rested on Liam's shoulder with quiet confidence rather than tension, because for the first time since this began, she was not standing there alone, not carrying the full weight of the past by herself. Liam walked beside her, his small hand occasionally brushing against hers as if reminding himself she was still there, still steady, and when they reached their place, he looked up at her briefly, offering a small, trusting smile that made everything else fade for just a second. Across the room, Daniel stood near the front, his posture unchanged but his presence different now, no longer distant, no longer separated by uncertainty, and when their eyes met, there was no hesitation, no distance left between them, only an understanding that whatever came next, they would face it with the truth fully revealed. The judge called the room to order, his voice measured and clear, bringing the focus back to the matter at hand, but even as he spoke, it was evident that this was no longer just a standard proceeding, it was something shaped by everything that had been uncovered, everything that had been withheld, and everything that now demanded to be considered. Having reviewed the new information, the judge began, his gaze moving between Emily and Daniel. "It is clear that the circumstances surrounding this case are more complex than initially presented," and his words carried a weight that acknowledged not just the legal facts, but the human reality behind them. Emily listened carefully, her attention steady, her posture calm, because she no longer felt the need to defend something incomplete, she simply needed to stand in the truth of what had been revealed. Daniel stepped forward when called, his voice clear, controlled, but carrying a sincerity that had not been present before. "I am not here to disrupt stability," he said, his gaze briefly shifting to Liam before returning to the judge. "I am here to take responsibility for what I was never given the chance to know." And the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any argument could have, because it was not about claiming something, it was about acknowledging what had been lost and choosing what would come next. The opposing attorney spoke again, but his tone had changed, less certain, less forceful, because the narrative he had built no longer stood on solid ground, and the facts he had relied on were now part of a larger story that could not be ignored. Liam shifted slightly, his eyes moving between the adults as he tried to follow the conversation, and Emily placed a gentle hand on his back, grounding him, reminding him that no matter what was being decided, he was not alone in it. The judge listened to each side carefully, his expression thoughtful, and when the room finally fell silent again, he leaned forward slightly, his decision measured not just in legal terms, but in understanding. "The court recognizes that the child's best interest includes not only stability, but truth, and the opportunity for meaningful relationships," he said, his voice steady. "Given the newly presented evidence and testimony, this court finds no grounds to remove the child from his current environment." And Emily felt a quiet breath leave her chest, not in relief alone, but in acknowledgement of everything that had led to this moment. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his gaze shifting toward Daniel, The court acknowledges the father's right to establish a relationship, provided it is done in a manner that supports the child's well-being. And the words carried a balance, a fairness that reflected everything that had been uncovered. Emily glanced at Daniel, and for a brief moment, nothing else mattered but the quiet understanding between them, the recognition that this was not an ending, but a beginning, one shaped not by assumption or silence, but by choice. Liam looked up again, his expression thoughtful, and then he did something simple, something small. He reached out, his hand extending slightly toward Daniel, not fully, not with certainty, but with curiosity, with openness, and Daniel did not hesitate. He stepped forward just enough to meet it, his hand steady, his touch gentle, as if understanding that this moment did not need to be rushed, did not need to be defined all at once. Emily watched them, her expression calm, her posture steady, and for the first time, the future did not feel like something she had to protect alone. It felt like something that could be built together, carefully, honestly, one step at a time. And as the room slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm, as voices resumed and people moved once more, one truth remained quiet but certain: the past had been taken from them, shaped by someone else's decision, but the future, finally, was theirs to choose, and sometimes, that was enough to begin again.